There is an enemy more subtle than hatred, more corrosive than lies, and more dangerous than violence. It is thoughtlessness, a quiet erosion of freedom, morality, and truth. We often imagine that destruction comes from grand villains or towering forces, but what if the greatest dangers to humanity stem not from malice, but from the absence of critical thought, from the refusal to engage with the world, to question, to reflect? Today we explore a profound and unsettling idea that thoughtlessness, not evil itself, may be the true force behind the collapse of societies, and that recognizing this invisible threat is essential to safeguarding our freedom. When we hear the word thoughtlessness, we tend to picture carelessness, rudeness, maybe even selfishness. But what if thoughtlessness is something far deeper, far more systemic? Philosopher Simone Weil warned that attention, true, focused thought, is the rarest and purest form of generosity, and where attention withers, cruelty thrives. Thoughtlessness, in this light, becomes a kind of moral vacuum. It is not merely a lapse in politeness, but a refusal to see the reality of others, a blindness that allows injustice to unfold in plain sight. A person who fails to think critically does not necessarily intend harm, but in their inertia, in their refusal to engage, they become fertile ground for harm to grow. Their silence becomes consent, their passivity an endorsement, and so the quiet, ordinary refusal to think becomes a weapon far more effective than any sword. Why does thoughtlessness thrive? Because it is easy. Thinking is hard. It demands humility. It demands doubt. It demands the willingness to be wrong. And in a world overwhelmed by noise, by endless information, by slogans, by simplistic narratives, complexity feels exhausting. Certainty feels like relief. We are seduced by simple answers because they free us from the burden of wrestling with contradictions. But simplicity, when it denies complexity, becomes a breeding ground for fanaticism. In surrendering our critical faculties for the comfort of easy certainties, we do not simply make a mistake, we hand over our freedom. And history has shown, time and time again, that societies most willing to embrace simple answers are the ones most easily led into darkness. Institutions, political, religious, educational, thrive or rot based on the level of critical thinking they encourage. When institutions become authoritarian, they discourage questioning, they reward conformity. They promote obedience masked as virtue. In such environments, thoughtlessness becomes institutionalized. It is no longer an individual weakness, it becomes a collective ritual. People stop thinking not because they are stupid, but because the system rewards not thinking. Totalitarian regimes do not require wicked geniuses, they require bureaucrats. Ordinary citizens willing to stop asking questions. The machine of oppression is built not with monsters, but with the everyday decisions of people who choose comfort over conscience, convenience over complexity. It is thoughtlessness, not evil genius, that fuels the machinery of oppression. Here we turn to Albert Camus, a philosopher who lived through the turmoil of war and occupation. Camus understood that the absurd, the collision between our longing for meaning and the universe's indifference, often tempts people toward nihilism, toward surrender, toward thoughtlessness. But Camus rejected despair. In The Rebel, he argued that even in the face of absurdity, we must choose to revolt, not through violence, but through a constant conscious engagement with the world. Rebellion for Camus is the refusal to give in to apathy. It is the stubborn insistence on thinking, questioning, creating meaning, even when the universe offers none. True rebellion is the antidote to thoughtlessness. It is an act of defiance against the easy answers, the surrender of complexity, the abandonment of responsibility. Today, the machinery of thoughtlessness looks different, but it is no less dangerous. Social media rewards outrage over reflection. Algorithms feed us what we already believe. Politicians package reality into slogans. Institutions prioritize efficiency over understanding. In such a world, thinking critically is not merely difficult, it is actively discouraged. Nuance is treated with suspicion. Doubt is labeled weakness. The result, a society that drifts, not toward tyranny imposed from without, but toward collapse from within. Not through the violence of oppressors, but through the quiet decay of minds that stop questioning, stop engaging, stop caring. Freedom is not lost all at once, it is surrendered, bit, by citizens who forget that thinking is the highest form of resistance. What then must we do? We must think, radically, restlessly, courageously. We must resist the seduction of simplicity. We must refuse the easy certainties. We must cultivate attention in a world that profits from distraction. Because every time we choose to reflect, to wrestle with complexity, to doubt, to engage, we push back against the machinery of thoughtlessness. Freedom is not merely a political condition, it is a state of mind. It begins and ends with our willingness to think. In a world that begs us to look away, thinking becomes a moral act, a rebellion, a quiet revolution. And it is through this revolution of thought that we keep alive the fragile, luminous possibility of a freer, more just world. We often imagine that only grand gestures change the course of history. Revolutions, battles, protests, but history is shaped just as much, if not more, by the small invisible choices made by ordinary people. By the worker who refuses to falsify the report, by the teacher who encourages a child to question, by the citizen who asks uncomfortable questions at the town meeting, by the friend who challenges a harmful belief rather than remaining silent. Every small act of thoughtfulness plants a seed, and these seeds, multiplied across time and space, become forests of resistance, forests that cannot be easily burned down. Conversely, every act of thoughtlessness, every surrender to conformity, to apathy, leaves the soil barren. History's tragedies are built not just by monsters, but by countless tiny abdications of thought, courage, and responsibility. We are never too small to matter. Every moment is a crossroads. No exploration of thoughtlessness would be complete without Hannah Arendt. In her chilling study of Adolf Eichmann, a man who orchestrated logistics for the Holocaust, Arendt introduced the phrase "the banality of evil." Eichmann was not a monster in the classical sense. He was not driven by deep hatred or grand ideology. He was horrifyingly ordinary. A bureaucrat, a man who insisted he was simply following orders, thinking little about the consequences. Arendt concluded that the greatest evils in history are often not executed by fanatics or sociopaths, but by ordinary people who accept the premises of their state and society without questioning them, who believe that thinking is not their responsibility. Eichmann's real crime, Arendt suggested, was a failure to think, a failure to imagine the suffering of others, a failure to see beyond rules and systems. This is the terrifying truth, that evil need not look monstrous to be catastrophic. It can look bland, procedural, even polite. Thoughtlessness does not just permit evil, it enables it. Today, we face a new frontier. Technology has made information infinite, but not wisdom. Algorithms learn our desires and fears better than we do. They serve us content that confirms what we already believe, closing the walls of our mental world tighter with each click. We no longer need to choose thoughtlessness. It is chosen for us, curated and delivered on shimmering screens. Critical thought becomes not just unfashionable, but actively inconvenient. Complexity is bad for business. Nuance doesn't go viral. In this digital architecture, we risk becoming passive consumers of narratives we did not create, loyal to ideas we have not examined, fighting battles whose origins we do not understand. Freedom in the 21st century will not be defended by weapons or armies. It will be defended, or lost, in the mind. If we are to resist, we must become more than users. We must become thinkers again. There is another cost to thoughtfulness. It is often lonely. To think critically in an age of conformity is to risk standing alone. It is to risk being labeled difficult, rebellious, uncooperative, or worse, irrelevant. But the alternative, the comfort of the crowd, the applause of the unthinking, is far more dangerous. Søren Kierkegaard, the Danish existentialist, warned that the crowd is untruth. The truth is always the concern of the individual. To live truthfully, then, is to accept isolation, to accept misunderstanding, to accept the heavy sacred burden of choosing conscience over popularity. It is not an easy life, but it is the only life worthy of being called free. So how do we resist thoughtlessness in practical terms? How do we build a life of conscious rebellion? Slow down. In a culture obsessed with speed, slowness is an act of defiance. Pause before reacting. Reflect before speaking. Question everything. Every assumption, every narrative, every common sense claim deserves scrutiny. Seek complexity. When an answer feels too easy, too clean, dig deeper. Truth is rarely simple. Cultivate attention. True attention, to people, to books, to moments, is rare. Practice deep listening, deep reading, deep seeing. Endure discomfort. Thinking critically will often leave you uncomfortable, uncertain. Stay with the discomfort. Let it sharpen you. Act. Thoughtfulness is not merely an inner virtue. It must be expressed in action, in choices, in relationships, in resistance to injustice. Thought without action is safe, but it is thought acted upon that transforms the world. Freedom is not guaranteed. It is not a birthright we can assume, nor a trophy we can preserve in a glass case. It is an ongoing act, a process of vigilance, courage, and relentless thoughtfulness, and it is fragile. More fragile than we dare to imagine. The poet Rainer Maria Rilke once wrote, "You must change your life. In every age, in every society, there comes a moment when this whisper becomes a roar, when the world demands that we think, or perish. That moment is always now." The question is never whether freedom will be challenged. It will. The question is whether we will rise to meet that challenge, not with swords or slogans, but with the quiet, indestructible strength of thought. Not every act of thinking will change the world, but every act of thinking will change you. And a mind awakened once cannot easily be put back to sleep. In the end, the silent enemy of freedom is not oppression from without, it is the surrender from within. Let us refuse to surrender. Let us think, let us rebel, quietly, fiercely, endlessly. The most radical act is to think for yourself, always. Socrates. Throughout history, the true rebels were rarely those who shouted the loudest. They were often those who dared to think quietly against the current of their times. Socrates, standing barefoot in the Athenian streets, questioning politicians and poets, sentenced to death for corrupting the youth. Hypatia of Alexandria, a woman philosopher and scientist in an age that denied her very right to speak, ultimately torn apart by a mob. Baruch Spinoza, excommunicated from his religious community for daring to imagine a God that was not separate from nature, but identical with it. Simone Weil, a philosopher who starved herself in solidarity with the suffering of others, writing that attention is the rarest and purest form of generosity. These were not warriors with swords, they were warriors of the mind enduring loneliness, misunderstanding, exile and sometimes death, simply for refusing to stop thinking, and the world is different because of them. Every time we pause to question, every time we choose conscience over convenience, we walk the same invisible road they once walked. We join an ancient brotherhood and sisterhood of the mind, but not every rebellion is wise. In fact, the world is filled with false rebellions, shallow contrarianism that masquerades as thoughtfulness. There is a kind of rebellion that is merely reaction. If the crowd says white, it says black. If the culture moves right, it moves left. If tradition says yes, it screams no. But this is not real thinking.
It is merely the crowd inverted. True rebellion does not simply oppose, it transcends. It moves beyond knee-jerk rejection into independent thought. It refuses both blind obedience and blind opposition. In our age, there are many who brand themselves as independent thinkers, while simply repeating new dogmas, new slogans, new orthodoxies. Real thinking is rarer than ever, because it requires the courage to be unsure, to be out of sync, to live without a ready-made script. Real rebellion begins not with slogans, but with silence, not with rage, but with reflection. There is a loneliness to the thinking life that no one tells you about. It is the loneliness of seeing too much and belonging too little. When you begin to question deeply, you may find yourself estranged from your community, your family, even your former self. You may mourn the simplicity you can no longer reclaim, the easy answers you can no longer accept. You will walk through deserts of doubt, where no one can accompany you. You will long, sometimes desperately, to be understood, and find only echoes. This is the cost of consciousness. But there is beauty too, an austere, fierce beauty in standing alone and knowing you would rather be alone than asleep, and you are never truly alone. You are walking paths once walked by the greatest minds of every age, their footprints invisible but real beneath your feet. They endured their loneliness not for fame, not for glory, but because truth mattered more than comfort. And when you endure, you become part of their secret lineage, a lineage not of blood, but of spirit. In a world obsessed with noise, silence is revolutionary. The thinker is not always the loudest voice in the room. Sometimes they are the one who listens longest, who refuses to fill the air with empty certainty. The power of silence is not passive. It is the space where real thought is born. It is the crucible where true freedom is forged. The Stoics taught that what is outside our control is irrelevant to our peace. But how often do we give away our inner life to the noise of others? Choosing silence, reflective, attentive, searching silence, is an act of rebellion against the tyranny of distraction. It is in silence that we remember who we are. Every society spins dreams for its citizens, dreams of success, conformity, identity, belonging. Most people live and die without ever realizing they were asleep. Philosophy is, above all else, the art of waking up, of stepping out of the dream, however beautiful, however comforting, and facing reality with bare eyes. Plato's allegory of the cave is still the greatest metaphor. The prisoners believe the shadows are real, because they have never seen anything else. When one prisoner escapes and sees the sunlight, he is blinded, confused, terrified, and when he returns to free the others, they do not thank him, they want to kill him. To wake up is not easy. It is painful, disorienting, lonely, but it is the only life worth living. Every act of real thought is an escape from the cave. Every refusal to accept shadows as truth is a step toward the sun. You were not born to worship shadows. You were born for the light. Thoughtfulness is not a one-time awakening. It is not a single heroic choice. It is vigilance, daily, hourly, moment by moment. The mind is slippery. It longs for comfort, for certainty, for approval, and the world is full of forces ready to lull it back to sleep. Every day you will be tempted to accept easy answers, to fall into tribalism, to let someone else do the thinking for you. Resisting these temptations is a lifelong labor. It is the labor of freedom. There is no arrival point, only a journey that must be chosen again and again and again. At the end of it all, the truth is simple. Freedom is not given, it is not inherited, it is not guaranteed. Freedom is created in the private, often invisible decisions of individuals who refuse to stop thinking, who refuse to betray their own minds. You do not need permission to be free. You do not need an audience. You do not need a title, or a movement, or a manifesto. You only need the will to be awake. The world may grow darker, the crowds may grow louder, the walls may grow higher, but even in the deepest night, a single candle defies the darkness. Be that candle, be that flame. Think, question, resist, illuminate. and trust that somewhere in the unseen corridors of history, your light will matter. It already does.